Happy Monday, everybody. We're back to talking about World War I and the Russian Revolution, but today and tomorrow's set of notes are going to focus primarily here on what happened with the Russian Revolution. It doesn't span this entire time period. It really kind of starts, really about 1917. We'll get into some of those details today and tomorrow. They'll be a little bit shorter, and then that'll be all your notes for our unit on World War I and the Russian Revolution. Kind of an interesting event and period, the Russian Revolution. And of course, it's going to play a really big role in really establishing kind of the political struggles that are going to exist in the 20th century, mostly between the United States and the Soviet Union, because, of course, as a result of the Russian Revolution, we have the formation of the Soviet Union. So let's get right to it. Okay, so a little bit of history on Russia. We haven't talked much about Russia this semester, frankly, because there's not really a lot to say. Okay, so Russia, of course, is the world's largest country, um, and it's got a mixture of a lot of different peoples and Slavic peoples and some of the poorer, less uh, appreciated culturally peoples of Europe. It's believed that the characteristics of Russia were ultimately settled over 1,000 years ago by the Rus, which was a terminology for Vikings. So the Vikings may have actually settled Russia, around 800 AD or maybe a little bit before then, somewhere in that time frame. Um, and of course, much of the land of Russia is not really all that inhabitable. It's the largest country in the world, but a lot of that is extremely cold, and you're not going to find many people up there in a region like Siberia or something of that nature. So historically, in the grander scheme of things, when you're talking about the history of Europe, you don't talk about Russia as much. Now, Russia has had some really good leaders and some really bad ones. Good leaders include czars. The word czar, Tsar, or C, or I'm sorry, or Czar. Um, Tsar is a word used for a Russian king. Um, and just like in England, there were kingships and there were dynasties that would last generations before somebody else would step in from another family or something of that nature if there was no clear heir. Uh, and like I said, Russia had some great leaders like Catherine the Great, who was one of the great female leaders in world history. Peter the Great is another example of a great Russian czar. They also had some terrible ones. Most notably Ivan the Fourth, who is also known as Ivan the Terrible because of his ruthless leadership and his killing of many, many people during his time in charge in Russia. So from that perspective, the history of Russia is not all that different than some of these other European countries. But Russia just isn't all that involved much in a lot of the history of Europe early on, like in Germany, like in France, like in England, or Spain, and some other places. So again, when you compare its history, it's a history that again is a lot like these other European countries, but there's not as many conflicts in the history of Russia, at least before the 20th century. They're kind of on their own, doing their own thing, and aren't all that involved in the affairs of the rest of the Western world or the European world. Okay, part of this reason is because the other countries in Europe, which of course for much of this history are the other powerful countries in the world, aren't really all that interested in Russia. There's not a lot of trade value coming out of Russia necessarily. There's not a lot of, at least known at the time, valuable resources that could be gained by, being involved with Russia. So Russia is again just kind of off doing its own thing in its own, kind of sphere of influence in the world. Um, the one big export that comes out of Russia would be like fur trading. Lots of hunters would be in the Siberian wilderness and places like that, and where you could shoot a lot of animals and get a lot of animal furs and things. So those were one thing that were popular. Uh, but fur trapping was something that was actually much more popular in the Americas. In fact, when you think of the resources that Europeans came over to the Americas to find, particularly North America, um, the Spanish, of course, came over looking to find more gold because the Spanish only cared about gold and turning Native Americans into Catholics. Uh, the British actually came over primarily for farming and lumber. There weren't many trees. It's like they cut down all the trees in England, and they needed sources for timber, and lumber. So they came over for that. And then the French, though the French were here, and they were very much in the continental interior along the Mississippi River and areas, and they sought furs as well. So the fur industry uh, coming from France, from what they were gaining in the Americas, was actually more powerful than what the Russians were able to do. So that kind of hurt Russia economically as well. So, like I've been saying, because it's not all that involved, Russia really has its own unique history, and it's a history of limited conflict and involvement with the outside world. To right again, now here's Russia. All this light brown area is what we consider Russia to be. So Russia is an extremely large country. But if you get further east than this point, than the Ural Mountains, you're not going to find many people, living in these regions. It's not very habitable. It's very cold, and even to this day, there's just not a whole lot of people out in that part of the world. So, setting the stage for all that, we have to talk about how does Russia fall in the revolution. And when we're talking about these things, I want you to be able to compare with and make kind of common sense of the comparisons between the Russian Revolution and the French Revolution, because there's a lot of common ground here. So, um, just like in the French Revolution, the Russians were also influenced by, ideas that were popularized during the Enlightenment, new ways to look at the world around you. This encourages people that are poor, people with limited opportunity, to look at the world in a new way and take advantage of potential new opportunities. Of course, the biggest Enlightenment idea that made its way into Russia were the ideas of Karl Marx and the concepts of communism, the Communist Manifesto. That has a great deal of influence in Russia, and ultimately a variation of that called Bolshevism uh, is going to be what leads the charge in overthrowing the old Russian government. Now, one area I want you to make that comparison with the French Revolution, is this idea of representation. At the turn of the 20th century, the Romanov family, the Romanov dynasty, as it had been called, had been controlling Russia for a long time, and people were starting to feel, like they weren't being fairly represented by the Tsar. Sound familiar? It should, right? It sounds exactly like what happened in the French Revolution. People weren't fairly represented by the king, so they rose up in revolt and ultimately overthrew the government. Same thing ultimately is going to happen here in Russia, but there's a series of problems that happen over an extended period of time that cause a lot of the problems for the Russians, where they say, this guy's got to go, this system is no good, we need to replace it with a new type of government. So ultimately, sticking with kind of the second point here, um, people were growing more and more upset with the progress of Russia. Uh, there was a war between Russia and Japan called the Russo-Japanese War at the beginning of the 20th century. And Russia, of course, is a much larger and influential country, at least so we thought, than Japan. But somehow the Russians lose the Russo-Japanese War to the Japanese, and it again greatly puts into question the ability of the Romanov family or the ability of the Tsar to continue to lead this country forward in a positive direction. So what do people do? They respond with interest in new and different ideas. So you get a group of folks, educated folks, that are influenced by Karl Marx, different philosophies, and you get the birth of socialism in Russia. Now, there wasn't just one form of socialism, there were multiple ones, and we'll get to that later on, probably tomorrow. So there's multiple forms of socialism here because people look at what Karl Marx was saying, they take their own variation of that idea to heart, and they decide what do we want to do about these circumstances in Russia. But it's the same thing. The Tsar is living a very extravagant life. Automobiles were popular. At that time, kind of for the first time. Cars were something that was available to folks. The emperor, Tsar Nicholas II, owned 16 cars. Now, of course, famous people today own 16, 20 cars, whatever. People that collect cars, but in 1910, 1915, cars had only really been around and available to people for about 15 or 20 years. So just like the Palace of Versailles in France is this message of opulence and wealth that the emperor is able to enjoy, or the king is able to enjoy, these cars and many other things that um, the czar has, is an example to the people of, I'm going to spend my money on whatever, even though, and I'm not going to do anything to help the people, which of course is going to be really upsetting. So this is ultimately going to lead to revolution. So how does the revolution happen? Well, a couple things to consider. The revolution itself is not caused initially by the Bolsheviks, the people that eventually become the Soviets, okay, and form the Soviet Union. The revolution, just like in France, is started by what people? Poor peasant people, poor laborers, people that are unhappy with the direction of the country, particularly with the way World War I was going. Okay, World War I was going really, really bad for Russia. Um, Russia had, without question, the worst generals, the most inept military leadership of any country in the war, and by the numbers, we're giving up more land to the Germans and the Austrians, and we're having more casualties than anywhere else. Let me give an example. The Russian military was so ill equipped for this war. And remember, I said we were talking about World War I, how they weren't even fighting against the bulk of the German army. So you have a Russian army of over 1 million soldiers. You have a German army of over 1 million soldiers, but only about 15%, or we'll say 200,000 soldiers, are actually sent off to fight against the 1 million Russians. But somehow the Russians are so ill-equipped and so poor in this battle, this fighting, that they're losing the war, even though they have vastly superior numbers. That doesn't play well for a king or for a czar, and that makes people again question the leadership of the military and the leadership of the czar himself. Okay, so that's bad. Another example of this is because guns were in such short supply in Russia, when they would train new soldiers, in some cases, on how to carry, hold, and fire a rifle, they would train them on broomsticks. They would give them broomsticks to use in terms of being as practice for, as if you're carrying a rifle. Another thing they would do is, if there weren't any guns, they literally would send soldiers out to the front lines of the war unarmed and just say, well, just take a gun from some dead guy. So they'd send them out there unarmed and just say, find another Russian soldier that's dead and take your weapon from him. Okay. That again is not going to sit well with the people. It's going to make the government and the country look weak, and certainly negatively impact people's feelings about Russia and its government. Another example of this was the undue influence of a guy by the name of Rasputin. Rasputin was he's a very, very interesting historical political character. He was an advisor to the king, to the Tsar and his wife. Rasputin first gained favor with the Tsar because the Tsar and his wife had a son who was a hemophiliac, and Rasputin claimed to be this like healer and this mystical medical prophet figure. So he was there to treat their son for the hemophilia, and he quickly ingratiates himself with the family. The Russian people don't like this Rasputin guy because he seems kind of creepy, and he is super creepy looking. They don't like this guy. They don't like the influence that he has over the royal family, and they think he's forcing the king, or the Tsar rather, Tsar Nicholas II, to make some really bad decisions. Okay, and so people don't like that. Uh, Ultimately, what they do is this is where the story gets really interesting. They plan to assassinate Rasputin because, again, they don't like the influence. So some of the other lesser political figures within the government don't like Rasputin. They want him gone, so they decide to assassinate him. Now, there had been an assassination attempt on Rasputin a few years before. He was stabbed a few times, but he managed to survive. So this guy already has kind of an aura about him that he can't be killed. And he gets invited to a dinner at a prominent political family's house, cousins of the czar, and he gets fed this tea and cake, these teas and cakes that are laced with cyanide. And he eats some of the cake, and it seems nothing happens. He's fine, no ill effects from the poison. So then they decide to put some cyanide in some wine, and Rasputin has 3 glasses of wine, no signs, right? So then they say, well, we're going to have to shoot him. So a soldier, a guy goes down there, shoots Rasputin in the chest. He falls on the ground. He's dead, right? Um, so the soldiers then go back to Rasputin's house to make it look like there was a burglary and he had been murdered by somebody who broke into his home. So they do all that, and then they go back to recover the body, and they go back in the basement to get Rasputin, and then he jumps up and attacks the guy that he attacks the guy that you know that had shot him. Manages to get away from him, and then runs out of the house, um, trying to escape. Okay, uh, he gets shot again. Rasputin gets shot again, still keeps moving, gets shot another time, and finally goes down. They take his body to the river to throw him into the river. And some reports say that when they were getting ready to do that, Rasputin tried to escape again. So that's the second time they thought he was dead. But they throw his body in the river, and ultimately Rasputin drowns, and his body is found a couple days later, and he was actually dead this time. But it just fits into this mystical story of this crazy guy who just wouldn't die. So they tried to poison him, they tried to shoot him. Ultimately, they tried to drown. They tried to drown him before he's actually killed. So, with Rasputin out of the way, people felt it was time to get rid of the Tsar, and the Russian people revolt. Right? The Russian people say no more of this. This guy's terrible. And within a few weeks of the death of Rasputin, Tsar Nicholas and his family are forced to abdicate the throne. They step down and they go into hiding for a while until ultimately the whole entire family was gunned down and killed in the basement of their home by the Bolsheviks, who ultimately took over the government. And they went and they buried their bodies somewhere in the Russian countryside. And I think like 20 or 30 years ago, they finally excavated the bodies of the Russian royal family. So this is kind of what happened. We see a lot of commonality with the French Revolution. Commoners are upset. Peasants are upset. They're not well represented by the crown. The crown is living a very extravagant life while other people are suffering and are poor. So the people revolt, just like they did in France on Bastille Day, and force the abdication of the throne um, to nobody. They killed ultimately the whole royal family is out, and Russia now is in revolution, trying to find a new government to move themselves forward for the future. All right, folks, we will stop there for today, and we'll finish up the notes on the Russian Revolution here tomorrow. See you.